We welcome you back to this channel. In this video, we explore terrifying experiences of mediums who act as intermediaries with the beyond, facing the unknown. We will learn about stories of spiritual contacts that reveal how frightening it can be to communicate with the world of the dead. Go ahead, turn off the lights, and let's take one more step into the world of the unknown.
The wrong conjuring.
I have been offering my help as a psychic for some time. It's not something I advertise openly, but those who need my services know how to find me. It all started on a rainy afternoon when an elderly lady, Mrs. Smith, showed up at my door. Her gaze reflected a desperation I had only seen in those who had lost a loved one. In a broken voice, she asked me for help to contact her daughter, who had passed away 6 months ago. She needed to find peace. I offered her a cup of tea and we sat in my consultation room, a cozy space with candles, amulets, and an air of mystery that both soothes and unsettles my visitors. Mrs. Smith showed me a photo of her daughter, a young woman of about 25 with a vibrant smile. She wanted to talk to her, to know if she was okay, if she had found peace. I agreed to help her. Conducting a séance was not new to me, though it always carried risks. The first step was to create the right atmosphere. I turned off the lights, lit several candles, and arranged some crystals around the table. Mrs. Smith sat in front of me, her trembling hands clasped with mine. I asked her to close her eyes and focus on her daughter, to call out to her from her heart. I began to recite the incantation, a soft murmur that resonated with the sound of the rain hitting the windows. Little by little, I felt the temperature in the room drop, an unusual cold that penetrated to the bone. The candlelight flickered, and a shadow materialized in front of us, diffuse at first, but then more defined. I asked if it was Mrs. Smith's daughter, trying to stay calm. The figure did not respond. The shadow was tall, much taller than the young woman in the photo, and its presence filled the room with an oppressive feeling. A barely audible whisper began to fill the air, a strange language I had never heard before. I told Mrs. Smith that something had gone wrong, that it wasn't her daughter. Suddenly, the figure lunged at Mrs. Smith, enveloping her like a dark shroud. The woman screamed, but her voice was quickly muffled. I rushed towards her, trying to separate them, but the shadow was stronger than it appeared. I felt an invisible force push me back, making me fall to the floor. The shadow began to deform, taking on a more grotesque appearance. Its hands were long and bony, with fingers that looked like claws. A face emerged, gaunt and with empty eyes radiating pure evil. Mrs. Smith was paralyzed, her eyes wide open, reflecting a horror only she could see. I struggled to my feet and tried to remember the words of the reverse incantation, a formula to break the bond with the beyond. I began to recite it desperately, my voice trembling but steady. The shadow let out a chilling screech, a sound not of this world, and slowly began to fade. When the shadow disappeared completely, I rushed to Mrs. Smith. She was unconscious but breathing. I shook her gently until she opened her eyes, filled with tears and terror. I felt deeply sorry it wasn't her daughter. Mrs. Smith weakly nodded. I helped her up and took her to the living room, away from the consultation room. I gave her water and tried to calm her as she sobbed. She asked me what that thing was. I honestly replied that I didn't know. Sometimes when trying to contact the beyond, something else responds. That night after Mrs. Smith left, I cleaned the consultation room, making sure to seal any open doors to the other side. But something changed within me. The sensation of that dark presence didn't completely fade. I knew that something had crossed the threshold and stayed. Since then, I've felt a presence in my house, small shadows moving in the corners, inaudible whispers at night. Although I try to stay calm, I can't help but feel that I made a terrible mistake, and now I fear that I will never be alone again.
The child's plea.
I had heard about her for years. Jessica, the renowned medium, was known for her ability to communicate with the dead and her involvement in paranormal cases throughout the region. When the paranormal investigation team invited me to participate in a special investigation with her, I couldn't resist the opportunity. We had been trying for months to capture conclusive evidence of the existence of ghosts, and this time we were equipped with the latest technology: night vision cameras, motion detectors, and a special recorder designed to capture voices from beyond. We headed to an abandoned mansion on the outskirts of the city. The house, built in the 19th century, had a dark history. According to rumors, it belonged to a wealthy merchant whose son tragically died in an accident, and since then, the place was haunted. As we approached, the air grew denser, and a sense of unease took hold of us. Jessica led the group, her calm but determined presence giving us a strange sense of security. We entered the mansion, and the creaking of the doors echoed like a muffled scream in the oppressive silence. The walls were covered in mold, and dust floated in the air, illuminated by our flashlight beams. The atmosphere was suffocating, as if the house itself was rejecting us. We set up in the main hall, a vast space with high ceilings and rusted chandeliers. Jessica sat in the center, closing her eyes to concentrate while we strategically placed the cameras. The special recorder, known as an EVP, was set on an old table in front of her. We were ready to begin. Time passed slowly as Jessica remained in a silent trance. The silence was so deep we could hear our own breathing. Suddenly, the temperature dropped sharply, and a chill ran down my spine. Jessica's eyes snapped open, and at that moment, we knew something had changed. We turned on the recorder and began asking questions into the air. Jessica translated what she perceived, her whispering voice resonating in the dim light. Several minutes passed without response, until suddenly, the recorder emitted a distorted sound. We played it back and, through the static, a child's voice clearly whispered, "Help me." Fear gripped us, but Jessica urged us to continue. We kept asking questions, and the recorder captured more voices, some clearer than others. A deep voice warned us, "You are not alone." Jessica shuddered and began to describe the presence of a child, alone and scared, trapped in the spiritual plane. We decided to explore the house, guided by Jessica's indications. We climbed to the second floor, where the child's room was located. Upon entering, the atmosphere felt even heavier. Jessica approached a dark corner and pointed to a specific spot. I felt the air grow denser, harder to breathe. Suddenly, an ethereal figure of a child materialized before us. His empty eyes and sorrowful expression froze our souls. The child reached out to Jessica, who closed her eyes and began speaking in an ancient, unknown language. The child's figure slowly began to fade, leaving behind a sense of relief and peace. We thought it was over, but then, a dark shadow rose from the opposite corner of the room. It wasn't the child, but something much more sinister. The form began to move toward us, growing in size and density. I felt an intense cold, as if death itself enveloped us. Jessica shouted something in her trance, but the figure did not stop. We turned on all the lights, trying to ward it off, but it was useless. We ran downstairs, but the shadow followed us, filling every corner with its oppressive presence. We reached the main hall, and Jessica stopped, facing the entity. Her hands trembled, and a dark energy enveloped her. The shadow seemed to absorb the light, growing and twisting like a storm of nightmares. The house vibrated with a malignant energy, and the recorder captured a chorus of disturbing whispers. "You will not escape." Jessica collapsed to the floor, exhausted and trembling. We helped her up and left the house without looking back. Back at the studio, we reviewed the recordings. The voices were clear, and the images of the shadow were indisputable. We had obtained conclusive evidence, but at a cost. Jessica decided to retire from paranormal investigations after that night. The experience had deeply marked her, and we understood why. The mansion was demolished months later, but the memories of that night remain alive in our minds. Although we captured the voices of the dead, we learned that some secrets are better left buried. The shadows from beyond do not forgive, and the line between the living and the dead is thinner than we imagine.
Voices from the basement.
My name is Laura, and I am a medium. Since I was little, I have had the ability to communicate with spirits. I've always felt that this ability was more of a curse than a gift. Today, I want to share one of the most terrifying experiences of my life, which happened a few years ago when I was called to an old house on the outskirts of town. The house in question belonged to the Johnson family, known in the region for their wealth and tragedies. Several family members had died under mysterious circumstances, and the last tenant, Mrs. Eliza, had been found dead in her bed, with an indescribable expression of terror on her face. The house had been empty since then, but the new owners wanted to renovate it and wanted to make sure there were no presences before starting. From the moment I crossed the threshold of the house, I felt a cold that penetrated to the bone. The air was heavy, as if the house itself was breathing with difficulty. The new owners, a young couple, waited nervously in the living room. I asked them to leave me alone so I could concentrate better and started to explore the rooms. The first sign came in Mrs. Eliza's old bedroom. A soft voice, barely a whisper, said my name. Laura? Laura? It was as if the air itself was speaking to me. I felt a chill run down my spine. I closed my eyes and focused, trying to open my mind to the energies of the place. Suddenly, an image hit me. An elderly woman with gray, disheveled hair, sunken eyes, and a mouth that seemed to try to scream but without making a sound. Mrs. Eliza. As I progressed through the house, the whispers became more intense and clearer. They weren't just voices. There were cries, screams, and children's laughter echoing in the empty hallways. In the kitchen, I saw a small girl in a white dress stained with blood who disappeared as soon as I saw her. I knew I had to go to the basement, where I felt a stronger presence. The basement was dark and damp. The air was almost unbreathable. I lit a candle and started down the stairs. Every step felt like I was stepping into the mouth of hell. When I reached the bottom, I saw an old trunk that seemed out of place. I felt an evil energy emanating from it. I cautiously approached and, upon opening it, found old toys and photos of the Johnson family, all with their faces burned. Suddenly, the candlelight flickered and went out. A piercing scream filled the air. I felt invisible hands grabbing me, scratching my skin. I tried to defend myself, but it was like fighting the air. Then I saw it. A dark figure with bright eyes and a macabre smile, slowly approaching. It had no defined face, just a black silhouette that absorbed all the light. I recited prayers and protection mantras, but the entity did not retreat. I felt its hatred and its desire to harm me. In a moment of desperation, I remembered Mrs. Eliza's name and spoke it out loud. The figure stopped, as if the name had impacted it. "What do you want?" I screamed. "What do you need to leave this house in peace?" The entity transformed. The dark figure vanished, and in its place appeared Mrs. Eliza with tears in her eyes. "Justice," she whispered. She showed me visions of her life, abuse, mistreatment, and finally her murder at the hands of her own son, who was now trying to sell the house. Her spirit was trapped by pain and injustice. I convinced the new owners to find Mrs. Eliza's remains and give her a proper burial. The son was arrested for his crimes. Once justice was served, the voices and apparitions in the house ceased. The Johnson house finally found peace, but the images of that night remain etched in my mind. Every time I close my eyes, I can see the bright eyes of the dark figure, and I hear the whispers calling me from beyond. Although the Johnson house is now quiet, I have learned that the past never completely fades away. The spirits of those who have suffered remain among us, seeking justice, redemption, or simply to be remembered. As a medium, my job is to give them a voice, even if that sometimes means facing the darkest horrors.
Thank you for journeying with us through the dark passages of these stories. If you enjoyed them, give us a like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss more tales of terror. Until next time, where fear will once again be your companion.